The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Pleasure to rise and speak to concurrence in the committee's report, as well as the amendment to send it back to committee, and importantly to affirm and to clarify that in all its reviews of the procedures and practices of the House, the committee will only make recommendations to the House that enjoy the support of all members of the committee. As I'm sure you know, and as all members of this House know, that's been the subject of some debate pertaining to some other issues before the committee. And it may be that at various times some members in the past in Parliament have made arguments for why it might not make sense to always proceed on the basis of all party support. I'm not sure I would agree with those arguments, Mr. Speaker, but I can say, and I want to speak to, because I think it's important both to this motion and to other matters at Proc, that in the particular circumstances of this Parliament and where we've come from October 2015 until now, it is important that if parties are going to engage in discussions, whether it's about family-friendly or other rules about the House and changing them, that opposition members have some assurances from the government before setting out on that discussion that they're going to have a proper decision-making process for the end of that discussion. Because what we don't want to do is create a pretext for the government to ram through whatever changes it would like, whether it's with respect to family-friendly or other changes to the rules of the House, Mr. Speaker. So that's why, notwithstanding any general arguments about why we may not in every case want all party support for this or that or the other thing, in this particular Parliament it's important that we have those reassurances, because whatever good faith or trust the government might have asked for at the beginning of its mandate has been burned up by that government. It took a serious hit about a year ago when the government decided to introduce Motion 6, which I think was a pretty ugly motion, frankly, Mr. Speaker, that sought to handcuff Parliament and make it a creature, essentially, of the government. And whenever something was going on that the government didn't like, it would simply be able to shut down debate or adjourn the House, and to do it at will, which is why when we see, arguments from the government about, on some issues about, programming bills, for instance, because they want more predictability in the House, Mr. Speaker. Well, Motion 6 had nothing to do with a predictable schedule. It had nothing to do with making the hours that we stay or leave predictable for the sake of members with young families or for the staff of members with young families. So I think there's good cause to suspect that when the government talks about making the House more predictable for the sake of families, really what they're doing is using the arguments of predictability and using young families as a screen for doing whatever is convenient to them at the time. I'm sure, because I'm going to be splitting my time with the member for Hamilton Centre, he'll have more to say on that. So I'll leave that alone for now. That predictability, I don't think, is a real value that the government is promoting. I think they're cherry picking when they talk about predictability, and they're cherry picking when it's convenient for them to have concern for members with young families, and when they won't, frankly, Mr. Speaker. So that was part of Motion 6. I raised that argument just as one example of where we started to hear what if you're just listening through the news and you're not here in this place every day and you don't see the way the government operates on a daily basis, sounds like a reasonable argument. Yeah, I mean, if you have a family, isn't it nice to know whether you're going to leave at 6 or whether you're going to leave at 8? Well, Motion 6, when they had that in their mind, had nothing to do with that. And then another issue that pertains to this, because it has to do with democracy and it has to do with how we set the rules for democracy, was on electoral reform, Mr. Speaker, where again we had the government say, hey, we need opposition members to engage us in good faith. In fact, we're even going to go so far as to tell them, which the government ought never to do, to tell members what they should or shouldn't do, to go out into their constituencies and to hold town halls and then to report those findings back to government, which many MPs on this side of the House did in good faith. And the results that came through that process and through the extended traveling of the committee that heard from a number of experts and ordinary Canadians themselves was that they wanted a change in the voting system, Mr. Speaker. And then the government went further, and they even, in supplementary estimates, they asked for over $3 million extra to be able to conduct a survey. As we found out later, that was just the cost of them breaking a promise they never intended to keep, Mr. Speaker, but not before they caused Canadians to have to pay a considerable amount of money in order for them to get to where they felt comfortable breaking that promise. Not because of what they heard from Canadians, but simply because they realized they weren't going to be able to blame it on someone else, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you that those kinds of moves, whether it's Motion 6 or whether it's on electoral reform, really undermine the sense of trust that's necessary to be able to move forward with democratic reforms in a country, whether it's changing the way we vote or whether it's changing the rules of this place. Members want to know that they're dealing with a government that's actually negotiating in good faith. And I put to you that those two examples go a long way in explaining why it is that all the opposition parties are not prepared to extend the benefit of the doubt to this government, as we did on the electoral reform file. But you only get so many chances, Mr. Speaker, to engage in those processes in good faith. Now what the opposition parties are asking for when it comes to reforming the rules of this place is quite reasonable, particularly in light of that lack of trust and good faith, which is just for the government simply to commit to what has been done many times in the past before, which is to say that when you're going to change the rules of the House, you sit down with the other parties and you say, first of all, whatever we're going to go forward with is going to be something that all the parties of this place agree to. And that's it. That's not a lot to ask for. There's a number of examples where that's been done before. That includes the McGraw Committee, Mr. Speaker. And if anyone wondered if all party consent would lead to gridlock and not being able to get anything done, I would remind the House that it was on the McGraw Committee that you had a speaker elected by secret ballot for the first time, which is interesting. It was a major reform of the House. That wasn't the case before the McGraw Committee. It was out of the McGraw Committee that you got votable private members' business. Granted, not in the form that we do it now, where every PMB becomes votable if it makes it to the floor of the House, but it was out of the McGraw Committee, which required all party consent, that you actually got some of those first reforms, Mr. Speaker. So the idea that you can't make substantive, meaningful reform to the rules of the House because you're requiring all party consent, or the other side of that coin, which is that somehow the only way to make meaningful and substantive changes to the rules of the House and to improve the functioning of this place is to have a government come in that got, and I'll remind the House, Mr. Speaker, less than 40% of the vote, come in and steamroll the opposition parties and make whatever rules they want, whether it's respect to what we're talking about today, which is some of the proposals around family-friendly things, or other rules of this House, Mr. Speaker. So that's just not true. If anyone's getting up and saying the only way to make the House more modern and more efficient and to substantially change the way we do business here is that it has to be a strong-handed government that comes in and whips this place into shape, members of all parties traditionally have been willing and able to get together and to hammer out new ways of going forward that represent the changing trends of society and work-life balance and everything else. It's been done. It's been done, Mr. Speaker. So the idea here that somehow it's going to take a strongman government to come in and make things right in a place that sure has its challenges, but I think overall operates pretty well, Mr. Speaker, is just not on the table. Particularly funny coming from a government that has one of the most cautious legislative agendas that we've seen in a long time. I mean, they've been in government for a year and a half, Mr. Speaker, and they've only seen fit to introduce about 40-some bills. Most of those are just kind of regular procedural bills that have to do with the estimates process. Some of those bills are bills that were required because of decisions of the Supreme Court that required the government to make a decision. And then a third major category of those bills are simple repeals of Harper-era legislation, which it's not like that took a lot of time to prepare. And with the exception of some of my colleagues on the opposition benches here from the Conservative Party itself, tend to have pretty widespread support here in the House of Commons. So, I mean, when you take those three categories of bills together, what's left in terms of an authentic legislative proposal of the government is not very much, Mr. Speaker. So the idea that we somehow have to overhaul the rules of the House to make it easier for government to ram things through, which I submit to you, Mr. Speaker, is a good part of what's really going on here, for a government that can't bring itself to actually write any legislation of its own is just laughable. Of all the governments, at least if we're going to change things to make it, quote unquote, more efficient around here, it should be for a government that's actually presenting a lot of legislation, Mr. Speaker.
Avant des questions et
Before moving to questions and comments, it is my duty to inform the House, pursuant to Standing Order 38, that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. The Honourable Member for Nanaimo Lady Smith on the environment, the Honourable Member for London Fanshawe on national defence, and the Honourable Member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman on national defence.
comments. Question et commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, I have had the good fortune of being able to work on PROC committee before, and in different capacities in my days as an MLA, dealing with rule changes and the importance of rules for this House. And the question that I have for the member is that when I recall the proceedings of what had taken place in the last time we actually attempted to do rule changes, it was very difficult in order to get any real changes that were tangible accomplished, because at the time there was a feeling, well, maybe we should be looking at getting all parties on side. The government at the day didn't really feel motivated to change rules. It seemed to have a laissez-faire approach at rules and the need to reform. We believe that's one of the reasons why is Canadians want to see a modernized Parliament. And my question to the member is, would he not agree that looking at how we can modernize Parliament is in fact something that is very admirable, and we should at the very least get on with the discussion paper or have that talk at the committee level, allow those expert witnesses to come forward and share their thoughts on it. I, for one, have a number of thoughts that I would like to share with the House, and I hope to do so relatively shortly.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd start just by mentioning that the previous government didn't have a desire to change the rules and then didn't get them changed is hardly a criticism. I don't even know that it's really the beginnings of a criticism. What I do know is that this is a government that has committed to changing the rules of the House, and then the question becomes, are they proceeding in a way that will actually achieve so-called real change? And if you look at the record, attempt number 1 was motion number 6. It was a colossal failure, and rightly so, for the government. That motion never should have come to the floor of the House of Commons in the first place, and it certainly wasn't any attempt on collaboration. And then instead of learning from that mistake as a government that in good faith wants to change the rules of the House to make it better, as many members on all sides of the House want to do, they took the same tack, which was to publish their paper. Fine, you got some ideas, share them around. That's fine. The issue became when they then came to PROC and said, you guys better come out with recommendations from this majority-led, government majority-led committee, and on this timeline that we decide, and we're going to have our members ram that through at the committee. That was the problem. It's a problem of process. I submit to the government, if they're serious about changing the rules of the House and not just throwing the House into disorder, then they should get on having an appropriate process and proceed in an appropriate way. And with the lack of good faith that's there now because of the government's way of proceeding, they need to agree to have all parties agree with any changes that they'll make.
Question et commentaire. L'Honourable Député de Beauport.
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. An excellent speech in the House, but I would like to ask a question. On page 2 of the document tabled by the Minister with respect to the modernization of procedures at the House of Commons is the word autonomiser regarding the legislative process, so automation. Now what is necessary would be to simply close the Prime Minister's office. That would be wonderful. And we put an end to party discipline. Those are things that prevent members from adequately representing their fellow citizens and doing their work. Secondly, and here's my question for my colleague, There's talk about an electronic vote. Now, I came here, Mr. Speaker, to save the honor of this institution, to represent my fellow citizens. So the idea of having a possibility where someone can simply sit and push a button to vote seems to lack honor, especially if it's from a riding office. Well, we could imagine a situation where an employee pushes the button and votes instead of a member of parliament. Is it showing a lack of honor by allowing a member to vote without actually voting and representing his or her constituents?
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
I thank the member for the question. I came here too to stand up for the issues that I feel are important, and I'm happy every day to take a stand and to stand up here for those issues. So I too have a problem with the idea of allowing electronic voting. If we were to do something of that nature, it seems to me that it would have to be done here. The vote would have to take place here. We would need to know which members are present and which are not, so that other members couldn't push a button and vote for someone for who isn't in attendance in the House of Commons. So there are many problems with that type of electronic model. I don't support the initiative myself. And thank you very much for the question.